To begin, I will discuss how normal people adapt to the diving conditions acutely by looking at the mammalian diving reflex. Then, I shall discuss the acclamatory adaptations by looking at altered physiology of elite divers. We were going to ask Clara to perform an experiment, but since we are all home, we can't do so. I'll explain how it was to work though. Clara was to put her face in a bowl of room temperature water, and we would time how long she could hold her breath. We could monitor her heart rate using my EKG machine. She would then put her face in a bowl of cold water, and we'd take the same measurements. So, let's discuss what would have happened. First off, the mammalian diving reflex is an acute response that occurs when the face comes into contact with cold water. As such, it is meant to help the animal stay submerged underwater for longer periods of time and stave off drowning. The ability to remain submerged depends on the amount of O2 getting to the vital organs and to the brain. So, what we should have seen in Clara's results would be an increase in apneic time when she was in the cold water. So how the diving reflex works is as follows. First, if the person is not prepared for submersion, they will gasp for air upon contact with the water. This should help to fill the lungs with air. But there are several reports of this gasping reflex doing more harm than good, and actually causing people to inhale water. In most cases of diving, the person holds their breath and there is no gasp reflex. Second, the diving reflex induces bradycardia and peripheral vasoconstriction after about 30 seconds of submersion. We should have seen that Clara's heart rate is slower in the cold trial than in the room temperature trial. The bradycardia and peripheral vasoconstriction are meant to reduce the oxygen consumption, thus increasing the apneic time. In addition, there will be an increase in lactic acid in the plasma, and that will incur peripheral anaerobic respiration. Another component of the diving reflex is splenic contraction. The diving reflex causes the release of erythrocytes, that is to say red blood cells, from the spleen to the bloodstream. This increases the oxygen carrying capacity. It has been shown that serial assays result in longer apneas because the spleen would have already released the red blood cells. The spleen holds about 8% of red blood cells. That's about 200 to 250 milliliters. Low oxygen and high carbon dioxide can trigger splenic contraction. Another feature of the diving reflex is the release of erythropoietin, or EPO, from the kidneys. EPO stimulates the formation of erythrocytes, and this will increase the oxygen carrying capacity in the long term. So in spite of not having Clara to do a live experiment for us, I remembered that we had done this lab in animal physiology too. So we had used different temperatures of water to see the effects on the heart rate. So here on the x-axis, you can see the temperature in Celsius, and on the y-axis, you'll see the percent change in the heart rate. So in blue, we have for the males, and in red, we have for females. It's not the best graph. We're missing a lot of resolution because what we should see is a hockey stick curve where all of a sudden it's much lower, but we're missing a lot of intermediate temperature values. But reading our graph as it is, we notice that the 30-second curve is beneath the 15-second curve, which means that after 30 seconds there is a greater decrease in the heart rate, which is notable and correlates to the theory. We can also notice that at the colder temperature, so at 10 degrees centigrade, our decrease in heart rate is much greater than at 30 degrees Celsius. Even though it might not be as pleasant for the face to be at 10 degrees, it actually could save your life if you need to hold your breath. Furthermore, we can see, and this wasn't talked about in any of the papers that I saw, but from our class data, we can see that the males have a greater decrease in the heart rate than the females. We would have to look more into this, but I didn't see anything in the study so far. Now we will look at the acclamatory response. I looked at articles that studied elite divers since they are not genetically adapted to deep diving as the Bajau are, but instead have achieved success underwater through repeated exposure and training. This just shows how far the human body can go without having genetic predispositions. A study by Engen et al. Demonstrated that normal people who trained for 2 weeks with apneic training could increase the time they held their breath by 44 seconds. And that's only in 2 weeks. They saw other results, such as an increase in EPO blood levels. They had a faster onset of cardiovascular changes by 3 seconds. They had a lower heart rate at the end, and they had higher oxygen saturation post-apnea. That means that they used less oxygen throughout their apneas. The researchers did not see, however, an increase in hematocrit, and that is because that 2 weeks is too short. But they did find reticulocytes, which means that there is an increase in red blood cell production. Another group of researchers, Boutin et al., looked at the effects of 8 weeks of training. They found that apneic time followed a steep increase in the beginning and then began to plateau. In 4 weeks, the time increased by 32%, but by the end of the 8 weeks, the increase was only 41%. They also showed that serial apneas were longer, which means that if you were to do 1, 2, 3, 4, one after the other, that the last ones would be much longer than the first. What's also notable in the results is that the hemoglobin concentrations and splenic volume increased, but the splenic contraction did not, meaning that the same amount of red blood cells was released, which means a 2% increase. Another group looked at the elite breath hold divers, and they found that there was no significant difference in splenic volume between them and untrained people. They also found no correlation between splenic volumes and the size of the person, but rather it was a correlation between the genetics and the spleen size. This is what Stephen will discuss in just a moment. They hypothesize that earlier on in training, the spleen may increase in volume, but later on in training, it will revert back to its initial size. So there were no splenic differences between the elite breath hold divers and the untrained people. However, there were some differences in those groups, and that accounts for acclamatory changes. So first off, there was an increase in hemoglobin and erythrocyte concentration. That means that the blood could carry a lot more oxygen in the elite breath hold divers than in the normal people. Furthermore, there was increased capillarization in the skeletal muscles, as well as a decreased diffusion distance. That is because the increase in capillarization means that there's more blood flow going to the muscles, and so that the oxygen has less far to travel. Additionally, there's more myoglobin in the muscles of elite breath hold divers than untrained people. That means it can have a higher storing capacity for oxygen, which they'll need if they're going underwater for quite a bit. Also, they have the ability to shunt more blood into the lungs and have a more dome-shaped diaphragm. That increases the pressure inside to sort of counteract the high pressure that they'll be getting from deep below the ocean. Furthermore, they also have a less sensitive reflex to breathe because they're less sensitive to the high carbon dioxide levels in their blood and the low oxygen levels in our blood. Now, normal people, when they have high carbon dioxide levels, like if you hold your breath for a while, you'll automatically feel that need to breathe. But the elite breath hold divers have been so used to this that they don't have such a heightened sensibility to that. So they can go for a longer time without breathing. An acute response to diving is the mammalian diving reflex. This is going to be incurred when your face meets cold water. After 30 seconds, your heart rate is going to lower and you're going to have peripheral vasoconstriction to decrease your oxygen consumption. Afterwards, you're going to have splenic contraction, which is going to release about 2% of your red blood cells, which is going to account for 200 to 250 milliliters. And finally, you're going to have your kidneys release erythropoietin to increase your blood cell count, and that will help you in the future. So you're going to kind of like invest in blood cells. There are going to be some acclamatory responses to diving, and in 2 weeks you can have a 44-second increase in apneic time. In 8 weeks you'll have an increase as well, but you'll see that you're going to start to plateau, so it's not like you can hold your breath for an infinite amount of time. That makes sense, right? Then finally there's going to be the elite divers who have acclamatory responses such as an increase in red blood cell count, an increase in hemoglobin concentration, more capillarization and myoglobin in their muscles. And they're also going to have some physiological changes in their lungs to counteract the high pressures of diving. So these acclamatory responses should be seen in the Bajau. But not all of the Bajau's responses come from training. There are some responses that are innate and very different, and that is what Stephen will talk about.